So let's talk through every single unit in Codex Astra Militarum with their new rules and points costs, which ones are looking strong right now, which ones are looking weak, and why. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Astra Militarum, and for this video we're doing a big unit roundup, talking through every single unit in the Codex and roughly how strong they'll be in game. Codex Astra Militarum has brought a massive amount of rules changes, 4 new detachments and heavy rewrites to the combined regiment, plus lots and lots of datasheet changes, and all of that needs to be taken in context of the new points for the units. For Games Workshop's usual Codex release pattern, they've generally kept us waiting for the points. Say for the Blood Angels, I think we had about 6 weeks between the launch box dropping and getting new digital points values for it, but it seems that they've been more generous for the Guard, and along with shipping out the box sets to a whole bunch of sanctioned content creators, they also provided them with points costs for the units as well. So of course diligent people on the internet have already compiled these into big lists, and it seems that in general the points costs for the Guard Codex are known. I think the vast majority of them come from Art of War's reviews, so shout out to them for actually bothering to go through and tell us the points cost of the new units, as it's sort of hard to interpret how strong they'll be otherwise. Goonhammer provided quite a lot of them as well, and I'm going to guess some other content creators did similar as well. Apparently these new points costs are going to be available to download in the pretty near future to allow Imperial Guard players to actually get games in with their Codex straight away after they get it in the launch box. So I strongly suspect that the updated Munitorum Field Manual will turn up within the next couple of weeks before the Krieg box goes on full sale on the 25th of January and people start to receive their codexes. I feel like that's quite a nice move from Games Workshop, doesn't really cost them anything, and allows Guard players to play with their new points and us to get a bit of a better grasp as to how things are going to work in the Codex without just having to guess what sort of points cost the units will be at. It definitely makes tier list videos quite a lot more relevant as well, rather than just going by the point cost before. We can actually go for the updated ones. Speaking of which though, for the subject at hand, for this one I decided to rank the Guard units into 6 tiers, starting with the lowest and moving up towards the highest. I sort of split the top tier into an upper and lower half, just because I feel like there's just a few units that really feel very standout compared with a lot of the rest. Obviously tier lists in 40k are rather arbitrary, some things could be ranked a bit higher or lower depending on your army, the context and personal playstyle. There'll be variations on terrain levels and competitive versus casual settings, though probably the biggest single thing that affects things in 10th edition is your choice of detachment, obviously some of which make some of the units way better than others. For the tank one you're likely to be taking more Russes and Dawns, and for the transport one everything that's a transport and something scary to go in it will go through the roof in value. For this one I'll try and go through fairly detachment agnostic, more sort of raw datasheet strength, though talk about a few of the detachments as we go along. There's some units that just feel obviously really strong in one detachment or another. Let's get into it though, and in tier 6 I've just chosen to rank the one datasheet, and that's the redoubtable but rather overcosted Aegis defense line. That's reportedly 145 points and unchanged, giving infantry behind it a 4+ invulnerable save, being fairly sturdy and hard to take down, but not really significantly more so than, say, taking a Lehman Russ Vanquisher or something. Unfortunately, even with a sturdy defensive profile and zoning out a bit of your deployment zone, I think this just really isn't worth 145 points basically to grant a bunch of infantry a 4+ invulnerable save. You may as well just take another 2 squads of infantry or something, or maybe some infantry and a transport if you do actually want to protect them. It doesn't have no value, and for 145 points you could probably make it work in a casual setting. I just feel like from a strictly competitive setting you're pretty much always going to be worth it to get something else. Moving onwards though, and up to tier 5, and these are the datasheets I'd rate as weaker. The Ministorum Priest got a Zealot's Vindictor in the update, so a bit of strength 5 and damage 2 melee, and a boosted flamer. Their job is to give sustained hits 1 in melee for infantry, and their main problem is being an infantry buffing character in a codex where they don't really have any good melee infantry to lead. They can't join Bulgrin. And again, out of trying to make the units do something that they're just not really all that great at doing and making some sort of fun melee guard build, perhaps with a big Kazachan block with an attached command squad and Ogre and bodyguard perhaps, I feel like this guy isn't usually going to get much time on the tabletop. If you're building for power, again I feel like you'd just be better off with virtually any other character. Next up, for 145 points for the Death Strike, which I maybe might be a bit more tempted to put between here and tier 4. That one's 145 points unchanged once again, and it still has its minigame missile sort of rule, where you mark a target on the board, the enemy's got a turn to scamper out the way, and then if they don't move away with enough units, you can trigger it, doing 2d6 attacks, hitting on a 2+ at strength 16, AP 4 and damage 1 to everything within 6 inch range of the marker. The issue with that is that for 145 points, if you hit any one unit with it, you're probably going to get far less damage than 145 points, and if the opponent really cares about something not getting hit, they can usually move it out of the way. I think the Death Strikes have the best value in maybe disrupting enemy castles, say if they're all hiding in a big line of sight blocking ruin, you could drop the marker on it and then make them have to have a serious think as to whether they want to stay or move out. Against the right army, that could genuinely have some interest if, say, you had a big tank gun line and then your opponent was trying to hide everything from it. I definitely wouldn't say it's completely useless, though again, for the most part, I think you'd just be better off getting another Lehman Russ tank or something like that. The Valkyrie is 190 points, and that was unchanged in points and unchanged in the Codex, a fast-moving transport with a 20-inch move to allow you to jump some men out of it. The only very small rules alteration that it had in the Codex was being able to do its sort of pseudo-rapid ingress style move with any infantry, not just deep strike ones. In general, that didn't really tend to be a good option anyway, as it was just a bit dependent on where your opponent moved their units, and you might have just wasted a turn by not moving up fast and disembarking them to shoot. My take on this one is there's nothing really wrong with the datasheet, it's just that Games Workshop want to charge flyers at far more than they're worth. 190 points just doesn't compare with things like the Taurox or Chimera, which can also get units where they need to go. Finally, in Tier 5, for other things I'd say are downright weak, is the Wyvern. 110 points and unchanged despite getting some fairly colossal nerfs in the Codex. It lost the heavy keyword, so now it needs an order to have the same firepower it had before, and it also lost Ignores cover. So basically it's just really quite bad damage output against even light infantry, and its main value might be in handing out a -1 to hit debuff, which I just think is not enough for 110 points. If you actually want to destroy anything with artillery, then just about anything else is going to be better. Moving onwards and upwards though, in Tier 4 we have the datasheets I'd say are kind of overshadowed, not usually going to be used in many competitive lists. First up we've got the Ogren Bodyguards, Nork Deadog and the regular one. They're 60 points and 40 points, both unchanged from before. And for the points cost, they both bring some big stats and somewhat punchy melee. The Ogren Guard is fairly flexible with the option for guns and shields and things, and Nork gets a better feel no pain, plus devastating wounds and his thunderous headbutt. I think the issue is that they'll want to join a command squad, and that command squad to a platoon squad, and overall it just gives you a slightly odd general purpose unit. The Ogren Bodyguard most wants to be in melee, but the rest of the unit largely doesn't. In general, it's just not really seen as a particularly good idea to go throwing a whole bunch of points at trying to make a unit just slightly less bad at something it's not really that great at. I don't think they're completely unusable for the points cost though, and could make some platoon units oddly something that your opponent might regret charging a little bit, but again it's been super rare to see these in any sort of competitive lists, and I don't really see that changing. Next up, and rather unfortunately, is the rather cool new Krieg Marshal. Lord Marshal Dreyer is apparently going to be 100 points according to Games Workshop's new ones, so more than the 80 points that he was printed. He does bring some interesting things to the table. He's got 3 orders, a 2+ revive on death, and devastating wounds if he's leading Death Riders on the charge. That is all nice enough, but I thought he'd be a little bit on the more niche side of things even if he was 80. If he really is up at 100 like this, it just seems kind of hard to justify in an optimized list. I don't really think that's cheap enough to make him work just as a lone guy wandering around for using that revive on death rule to get where he needs to. And if he's leading a Death Rider squad, then it looks like that would probably be a 240 point investment when he can hit kind of similarly hard for a Rough Rider squad that would literally be around about half that cost. As a result, he just seems a bit outclassed by the Attillans. Next up, we've got the Standard Commissar, 30 points confirmed by multiple sources, drops down from 35. He's a bit of a general purpose leadership support, adding a 6+ leadership to his unit, cancelling Battle Shock via execution once per battle round, and either a +1 weapon skill or +1 OC and leadership order. Even though he's cheap, I don't really see too many people taking him up for that. Battle Shock mitigation is definitely useful for the guard, but I feel like a lot of the time you could just get another 5 bodies on the line or something like that, and the command squads just feel like they'd offer a lot more to the platoon units at least, including a bit of Battle Shock mitigation in their own way with the OC of their banners. At 30 points though, he's definitely better than he was, and he might actually have a bit more temptation for the extreme small unit kind of role. You could put a single commissar into strategic reserve and just have him turn up to do a secondary objective at some point. It'd be hard to screen out that base from the enemy deployment zone, for example, or could do an action like the one that you need to be on the board edges for. I feel like with that role in mind, he maybe could have been a tier 3 if I was feeling generous. Next up, we've got the Baneblade variants, who did get a couple of improvements in the Codex, though I don't think it's really going to matter versus having lost Lord Solar orders. In the Codex, they're largely the same. The only differences are they've all gained a 12-inch move. They feel like they'd be best in the Hammer of the Emperor detachment, as they can pay command points to be able to ghost through terrain. You might not necessarily be able to get the entire tank from one side to the other, but means they could potentially clip through ruined walls and things to make their movement distance work better. And I guess maybe the transport ones could have some interest for doing some sort of big fun build with the mechanised detachment. The transport ones did get some reduction in their firing deck capacity. In general though, I just can't really see people using these compared with the squadron tanks, particularly the Rogue Dawn tank commander, but also just most of the Rosses. Not being able to get tank orders is quite a big deal, and they're both critical keywords both for Combined Regiment and for the Hammer of the Emperor, where most of the buffs are linked to that. I think the only thing that would significantly improve them would be Lord Solar having a balanced data slate update and saying that he could order them again. That'd make them at least a fair bit more tempting. I feel like with all those scary guns hitting on a 4+, you're just going to be better off with having multiple small tanks compared with one big one in terms of raw power. Lastly, for Tier 4, we've got the Manticore, which I was debating putting here or Tier 5. The Storm Eagle rocket tank did get some pretty massive nerfs. The big missiles were reduced to D6 shots, lost the heavy keyword, dropped down to Strength 7, and they don't have any built-in rerolls to hit anymore. As a slight trade-off for all that, they dropped 10 points, gains the anti-infantry 2+ keyword, and an OC debuff on what they hit. Unfortunately, it's just really not enough. They've got massively lower damage output than before. They're still alright against things like Terminators perhaps, but previously without an order they would have been hitting 3/4 of the time. Now they're hitting literally 1/3 of the time. They need more support, and even then they're not as good. And the OC debuff I just don't think will come off often enough or be powerful enough to justify a Manticore just literally to hand out that rule. To be honest, now I've said that all through, it probably would have been better to put them in Tier 5 than Tier 4, I think. I feel like it was basically just bad news for this guy, and if he was dropping to that profile, he needs to drop in cost absolutely enormously. Moving up into Tier 3, and it seems we're sticking with the artillery with a bunch of the other better ones. Next up for 140 points we have the Basilisk. This one did get nerfed by losing the heavy keyword, so it shoots worse for the same cost. Though hopefully it would have a few more tank orders going around now that the tank commanders get more. The damage output's still just not really very good. It's alright against Space Marines, though not particularly spectacular. The main reason I'd rank it here would be for that rather good debuff rule that it has, with a -2 to move, advance and charge. It might matter a bit more or less in some games. If it doesn't have infantry to shoot at, then that will be a problem. But for the odd game when it does keep a really important melee unit out of the fight for a turn or two, that could genuinely be quite a big swing for 140 points, even if it doesn't really do all that much damage. I guess it could be partly used as well to go max frustration factor for that siege regiment detachment, have a whole bunch of the enemy army slowed down, and then pick your next most favourite one to also get slowed with this guy. Next up, I've chosen to rank the new artillery team here as well. This one seems to have a higher points cost than previously listed. By the reported Games Workshop points, it's 95 points rather than 75. Out of the gun profiles, I do think that in reality the siege cannon is the good one. D6 shots at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 3. Just quite nicely general purpose and at least some threat against both infantry and vehicles. They also do have quite a lot better durability than I was expecting. Those sandbags must be made of some sturdy stuff. And its special rule is Battle Shock, which is a bit disappointing really. That's not going to have too much impact. I think perhaps if it had been 75 points it might have been a tier 2 for me. At the moment it's still just not really all that impressive damage output for the cost though, if you're paying almost 100 points for it, even if it does have some quite big chunky gun stats. Finally for the artillery, we've got the Field Ordnance Battery. These guys are 100 points, and probably the Bombast Field Guns are the most interesting one. A good flurry of Strength 7, AP -1 and Damage 2 indirect fire shots, with the Sustained Hits 1 rule when they're ordered. In a recent comparison of artillery profiles, it looks like they rank really quite high against light infantry and sort of Space Marine style profiles, though they will fall down quite a lot against anything particularly tougher. Overall, I feel like they're not awful, and the heavy las cannon version isn't completely terrible as well. The damage output is quite good. I just generally think that the damage output isn't so impressive that you'd want to give up the durability and mobility that tanks get in comparison. I think they need to be a bit more dangerous to outcompete the armour. Next up, we've got the newly reforged Death Riders of Krieg. It seems that these ones are going to be more expensive than printed in the Codex at 70 points per 5 of them and 140 for 10. Compared with the 60 or 120 that they were printed. These guys are 10-inch moving cavalry with a fair bit of infantry killing attacks between their sabres and steeds and the frag tip lances if the infantry have got bad saves, and their special rule is a reactive move one, where if the enemy moves within 9 inches of them, they can move 6. I feel like they just compare badly with the Attilan Rough Riders at the moment. I just don't really think that the reactive move is quite enough to change things. They will be quite good at taking down enemy light infantry that are taking objectives, though they might not be guaranteed to get the jump on their target with a 10-inch move and having to go around terrain. They're not enormously sturdy, and the reactive move, while okay, might still not be particularly reliable to actually save the squad. I think you could certainly have a unit or two moving forward to take the midfield and bully some lighter infantry, but if there aren't too many lighter infantry on the board, then they're going to run into problems in the way that the Rough Riders probably wouldn't. I really feel like they could have maybe used something like the Scouts rule perhaps along with the other guard ones, and maybe could have been another interesting option for midfield presence early on. I don't think they're particularly unusable, though I'd be kind of surprised to see them appearing in competitive lists at 70 points. I feel like even at 60 they wouldn't have been as standout as the Rough Riders. Next up, we've got the Ratlings for 60 points and unchanged. They're a cheapish unit of infiltrators with toughness 2 and bad saves, so are very easy to kill. And their signature move is to pop off a flurry of sniper shots that could maybe threaten some lighter characters, and they get to move, shoot, move, so they can move out of cover, shoot something, and fade away again. I feel like their precision damage output realistically isn't quite enough to be worth the utility of buying them in for that alone. I think they're probably going to be best off for a utility board control style unit, just stopping the opponent moving forward with scout moves or putting their own infiltrators in places, perhaps for one of the sort of board control infantry style detachments like the Recon 1 or the Siege Regiment. I feel like in general, compared with other factions, infiltrators though, they're just not really all that standout. Ideally, you often want something that's at least somewhat tough on the mid-board objectives, and they can't really do that, just hide away, even if that can still be useful. I just don't really feel like they compare great to the other factions' infiltrate choices out there, and Guardsman Marbo apparently got a bit cheaper. I feel like genuinely he could be worth looking at compared with these guys now. Next up, we've got the Kaschan Command Squad. These guys are 65 points, so +5 from the Platoon Command Squad that they kind of replaced. They do normal Command Squad things, a banner for +1 OC, a Master Vox to broadcast orders around the board, reviving models now with their Medipack, and the commander himself can have a bit of fighting power plus an order. Their special rule is granting the assault keywords to the weapons of their Kaschan jungle fighters that they be leading. I feel like that is genuinely quite a helpful buff for them. They get to keep up the firepower while still pressing towards the mid-board objectives at maximum speed, with move as well thrown in if they need to. I feel like the problem with these guys are that the Kaschan jungle fighters just don't feel like the unit that you really want to support with a leader squad. I feel like maybe it was different when Strachan could punch hard enough to be able to take down entire squads by himself. But otherwise, usually for most armies, I think I'd be more tempted to field more individual units of Kaschans instead, and have them as units that can individually trade with the enemy, do actions and hide away till they do so. That feels like probably the more optimal way to use them, even if a big squad of 20 with these guys could still have some interesting stuff between the fast movement and orders and other benefits. I think I'd just be more tempted to use that kind of squad with Deathcore or Cadians though. Next up, we've got the Hydra anti-aircraft vehicle. This one seems to have increased in cost a little bit from 85 to 95. It's a cheapish tank with 4 shots at strength 9, AP 1, damage 3, twin linked, rerolling hits against fly and anti-fly 2+. It is fairly cheap and sturdy and fairly expendable for the cost, and it can take buffs like extra AP and ignores cover quite well, which the guard can hand out with things like Lehman Russ Exterminators or Hellhounds maybe. I think at 85 points it was at least fairly usable. I think that bump up to 95 is really quite a big difference, to be honest. It's over a 10% increase, and as a result I think when it was at least fairly comparable with the Lehman Russes before, I think it's now solidly behind the majority of them. I'd say probably either here or tier 4, maybe a little bit borderline. If you happen to be matched up against fly things, then it might be alright. For 150 points out of the Lehman Russ variants, I feel like they're all solid enough. Out of any of them though, it would be the Lehman Russ Punisher that I would rate as probably the worst in terms of competitive play. This one's 150 points and unchanged, and it's just because for the vast majority of Imperial Guard armies out there, dedicated anti-infantry doesn't usually tend to be what you really need, just because the army tends to have quite so much volume fire on just about every unit out there. There's loads of blast weapons about which can chip into hordes, there's lots of stubbers and the heavy bolters mounted on tanks, and infantry all come with a vast swathe of las guns that don't really do much against armoured targets, though can still stack a bunch of wounds on one wound lightly armoured infantry. I think realistically for a main tank weapon you just don't really need that degree of specialisation. The rest of the tanks can still do pretty well against light infantry, they just kill heavier stuff too. I feel like maybe if you really wanted to use one it'd probably be alongside a bunch of other things that have gone really heavy into anti-tank. Maybe you could use 1 or 2 as some dedicated fire support for the Hammer of the Emperor if you didn't happen to have enough from other things. Next up, for 60 points, we've got the Primaris Psyker. This one gives you a 4+ invulnerable save for an infantry squad on a 2+, and I guess now that the Krieg Marshal will be going to Legends given that he's off the web store, he'd be the character that you can add to units to make them more tough, as even the command squads lost their built-in Feel No Pains in favour of resurrecting models now. Otherwise, beyond that, he also gives you some protection against psychic damage, and has a psychic Maelstrom attack that got nerfed in the Codex, dropping down from D6+3 shots to D6+1. So maybe a slightly disappointing cut to his firepower there. I feel like 60 points just feels a touch on the expensive side for him really. I guess if you do want to just make any one platoon squad as tough as it can be, the Primaris Psyker can do that. Maybe for Krieg or Cadians with character attachments perhaps. and they can actually be okay to chip into damage combos with that Psychic Maelstrom if they're say attached to Scions with their big wound rerolls in Bridgehead Strike or the Mechanized Assault. Overall, I think they're usable enough. I'd probably rank them broadly between here or tier 2. It just feels like they could go down in cost a bit. Finally, for tier 3, there's a couple of the sets of heavy weapon teams. The Krieg ones are reportedly 75 points per 3 of them, so higher than the Codex printed cost for 60. And these ones, I feel like the heavy stubbers, again like the Lehman Russ Punisher, probably won't be the most popular choice, so either a las cannon or their interesting boosted heavy flamer profile with an 18-inch range and damage too. Otherwise, compared with the other heavy weapon teams, for the extra points cost, they get Fires on Death on a 3+, while the Fire Coordinator is alive. The base teams have a tiny bit more durability with a 4+ save, though they're still not exactly tough, and particularly not so for 75 points. And they do get the extra model in the squad with the Fire Coordinator with his rather godly 48-inch shooting las pistol. I feel like for 75 points they're not terrible, but I think that's just a bit too much for them really. It does mean they could maybe get a round of fire off with the las cannon teams, and then when they inevitably get wiped out as top priority, get another 2 shots out of them. That is a solid advantage compared with the other heavy weapon teams, so you might get one more round of shooting compared with them. And for the flamer teams, it means that you could have a good stack of damage against some enemy infiltrators or something, and then threaten to overwatch when they move up and push onto the mid-board objectives, and potentially even fire on death once more when they're wiped out. It means that you could stack a lot of damage on infantry in the mid-board. I still think though, even for all that, probably something more like 60 to 65 would feel a bit more appropriate for them to me. Finally, for this tier, we've got the Cadian heavy weapon squads, which are pretty close to being flatly eclipsed by the Kazachan ones to my mind. The datasheet's near enough identical, but split in half. Aside from a tiny variation on their last small arms, the Cadians basically get the heavy weapon squads with the chance for overwatch on a 4+, where the Kazachan's get their damage against enemy vehicles and tanks. Out of the 2 special rules, I feel like the Overwatch one is a bit of a trap really. If you spend the 1 command point for them, then you're not spending it on something else, either just with high value full stop or better Overwatch. It still seems like there'd be a pretty good chance you'd be better off Overwatching with a Rogue or Dawn, even if you're hitting on 6s, or something that auto hits like those Krieg heavy weapons or a Hellhound. I guess maybe if you've got Ursula Creed in a firebase and you don't have anything better to spend her stratagem on, then maybe one of these could be a good receiver for that. But in general, I feel like this would be the heavy weapon team that might just be sitting out of line of sight and firing mortars, given that they don't really care about the special rule there. Or just allowing spam of more heavy weapon teams if you really want to have a ton of las cannons on the board. You could spam las cannons really quite a lot with heavy weapon teams if you wanted to now. Probably not a good idea in practice against the field, but if you play against someone that doesn't really have that much long-range firepower, they could be genuinely problematic. Moving onwards and upwards though into tier 2, I feel like really quite a lot of the guard datasheets belong here. Solidly usable, better in some detachments than others, perfectly reasonable to build around, but maybe not feeling that they've got crazy standout value like just a few of the datasheets have. First up, I have chosen to put all 3 variants of the standard platoon infantry squad here. The Cadian shock troops are 65 points for 10 or 120 for 20, which they were before. They bring the sticky objectives rule to the table, and that's nice enough to have at least 1 copy of in the army. Definitely adds a bit of incentive to take the first squad of those, and otherwise maybe one of the other big draws are characters, being able to be led by the Cadian Castellan or Ursula Creed, both of which I think are interesting characters, Creed in particular with her big orders and free stratagem. Just in general, the platoon units are pretty nice in the siege regiment and recon element, lots of buffs that seem to support them more than other things, and the 20-man ones are quite a good choice for reinforcements, though the same is certainly true of the Death Corps. Speaking of which, the Death Corps remains 65 points for 10 or 130 for 20. They did get a few changes in the Codex. Between their oddly convoluted system of asterisks and weapon options, it amounts to they can only take 2 special weapons per 10 of them now, and you don't have 100% freedom of which, and then you also get a Voxcaster provided you don't take the Plasma and Melter Gun. That was a small blow to their usefulness, given that they were quite good for farming out special weapons before. They got an extra 1 compared with the Cadians, though they did get a small improvement in the 2 med packs, now allowing you to heal D3+1 models rather than just D3. Otherwise for them, they've lost the option of the Marshal to lead them, which was really quite a big deal. He gave them a 5+ feel no pain, and that'll be sorely missed. They just won't be anywhere near as tanky on the mid-board objectives as they used to be. Though they can now take the Death Corps Krieg Command Squad, which does have a few of its own benefits, though maybe a touch more peripheral. Overall, between their regen and their damage rules, it probably makes them as mass damage dealing infantry versus the Cadians, depending on the character attachments you want. Though with the loss of the extra special weapon and the feel no pain, I feel like the gap has narrowed quite a lot. Overall, I still say they're solidly usable if you need to put a whole load of objective securing bodies and still do a bit of damage with special weapons. Finally, for the 3 infantry squads, we've got the Kazachan Jungle Fighters. 65 points for 10 of them or 120 for 20. They bring Scout to the table, plus a couple of Flamers, and their special rule was traded round a bit for a +1 to wound in the first round of close combat. I think they'll remain pretty solid for the role that they had before, just basically pushing models into the mid-board and then having a bunch of objective control and a unit that you don't really mind expending too much. I feel like small units is probably the way to go for them, either in cheap transports, maybe a Chimera or Taurox, or just going on foot. It was a bit disappointing to lose access to Ironhand Strachan, who could make the unit really quite a different one and punch really hard. I've also decided to rank the Kree combat engineers here as well, who are going up to 70 points per 5 of them or 95 for 10. For that cost you either get 5 or 10 guys with a toughness 3, a 4+ save, and then a bunch of strength 4 attacks, either at range or in melee, and they can get a flamer in the squad too. I feel like the fact that their squad is quite so close in points cost between the small one and the big one is actually really quite appropriate. A massive chunk of the value in the squad comes from their 2 special rules with 2 abilities to throw some scary mortal wounds at the enemy up close, averaging around about 6 mortal wounds or so if they get the jump on an enemy unit. Between a free grenade and that remote mine, they're obviously really swingy. I think it's understandable that Games Workshop didn't value them at 35 points, as if they'd gone for that they would have been literally probably the single strongest unit for the points in 40k potentially, just due to doing so much for so cheap. And to be honest, in their current form I could see the argument for either of those for the 70 or the 95. For the 70 points you're basically not spending too much more than cast chance, and still getting an expendable scouting nuisance unit, but one that can just randomly throw a whole bunch of mortal wounds at the enemy when it needs to. Though for the extra 25 points you can just upgrade to the extra bodies in the squad, make it a bit more of a commitment, but then have a unit that's at least fairly sturdy with a bunch of 4+ save guys, and still be threatening to throw that damage at the enemy the first time that they're exposed. Overall it's probably best that they're not just super overpowered auto-include. I feel like with that points cost they're still priced where they're interesting. Next up, we've got the Kaschan Heavy Weapons Squad. This one's 50 points, and as mentioned, it's basically the same as the Cadians, but shoots far harder against vehicles. You get inbuilt reroll ones to hit and wound against monsters and vehicles, so you probably want to give them las cannons to help with that roll. I feel like just for how cheap they are, there's a reasonable chance they could actually deal enough damage to justify their existence in one single round of firepower. If they get an order and then move out of terrain and shoot at an enemy vehicle, on average they do something like around about 4 or 5 wounds-ish to it. That's for a 3+ save vehicle out of cover, and that could easily equate to the 50 points worth of damage, at least in theory land. And then the onus is very much on the opponents to destroy them, as they're quite easy to kill, and if they don't manage that, then you could get even more value. Overall, with those big rerolls, I feel like that probably tips the balance enough that they're genuinely quite a good source of anti-tank. They're obviously incredibly fragile and not really all that fast or very order efficient, so far from auto-include. Next up, and staying at the 110 points, we've got the Tempestus Aquilons. They're unchanged from their kill team datasheet. At 110 points, they're paying a premium for their 6-inch deep strike for doing reliable secondaries, so the opponent can't screen them quite as easily. They've got at least fairly solid damage against backfield objective grabbers. Anything that's light infantry they should be able to threaten to clear out quite nicely. So hopefully on a good day can drop down, do behind enemy lines or something, and remove an enemy unit on the home field objective, all ready to replace it with these guys as they move up next turn. They seem nice enough in Bridgehead Strike when they can use some of the Scion synergies, or in Combined Regiment with their big volume fire really quite liking the lethal hits. And they're a fairly good target for reinforcements as well, giving you another close range drop even if they're wiped out. They can overwatch kind of surprisingly hard against lighter infantry as well in Combined Regiment with the lethal hits. Next up, for 60 points for 3 or 130 for 6, we've got the Ogrins. They're cheapish and toughish chunky boys, very nice for bullying enemy infantry with a whole bunch of volume fire from their Ripper guns, and then following it up with a charge and a bunch of melee hits. I think for 60 points they're kind of fine for what they do. They'll be able to draw a bit of enemy firepower, though while they're alright toughness, they will be killed by just about anything from small arms to anti-tank stuff. There are a few detachments that can help out infantry in various different ways. They could be nice enough in mechanised assault, where those Ripper guns will be getting some added punch jumping out of transports and things. Maybe could provide some more cheaper and expendable support alongside some Kazakin or Scions. Next up for the Bulgrins, they remain fairly expensive at 110 points per 3 of them or 220 per 6. They are almost double the cost of the Ogrins, but can weather some slightly unusual amount of firepower between a 4+ invulnerable save on their shields, a -1 damage, and then their feel no pain. They can make a disturbing amount of firepower go away. Weirdly, AP0 things often tended to be pretty effective against them, though that'll be a bit less the case now, as the Codex improved them to get a 3+ save. For their role fighting over mid-board objectives, I'd say they're alright, not desperately stand out but not useless. They are paying a big premium compared with what they did before, and I certainly miss Lord Solar Leonta's orders being able to move an extra 3 inches to be able to charge with a really big deal to get them where they needed to be. I feel like they are the right sort of unit though, that you can just park them on a mid-board objective and force the opponent to deal with them while the rest of the army gets about doing what it's doing, and they can be kind of hard to charge for some things for the risk of just killing maybe one or two of them and then getting hit back hard. Those clubs aren't great against everything, but against the right targets they can put in a surprising amount of work. Next up, we've got some more cavalry in the Artillery Rough Riders, 60 points for 5 of them or 120 per 10. It looks like the guard countercharge cavalry are unchanged. I still think they're looking really quite efficient for that points cost. They move 12 inches and have 2 wounds at toughness 4, which isn't durable against everything, but certainly isn't terrible for 12 points. And when they hit in combat, they get some steed attacks, plus either frag or melter lances, so it can do some serious melee damage both to lighter infantry and big tough tanks and vehicles. For their cheap cost, I think they're a fairly dangerous little countercharge unit, ideally hiding behind terrain and then riding out to be able to hit something that's coming on to try and attack your lines, potentially with move, or the +1 weapon skill order as needed. Guard don't really have a whole load of massively melee capable stuff, particularly with Bulgarins going up in points quite a lot, and that makes them fairly interesting for that. Feels like the majority of the detachments perhaps give them kind of limited gains. I guess maybe could be unusually tanky in the recon element detachment, maybe getting some fairly high saves if they can manage to get cover after they've killed what they need to. I'd probably rank them either towards the top of this tier to be honest, or lower tier 1. Next up, we've got the Lehman Russ battle tanks. I've ranked the vast majority of them here. I've just left off the Punisher and the Lehman Russ Exterminator. The Exterminator I've ranked a little bit higher, the Punisher a bit lower. After the changes they've made to them between the points changes and the datasheet updates, they feel quite a lot more closer together compared with what they were. I think that most of the variants can be used if you want to. Just generally they're really quite tough with big 2+ saves, 13 wounds, scary guns on the turrets, and then a bunch of other things to back it up, commonly multi-melters, a las cannon, some stubbers, and a hunter-killer missile. In general, they're going to be most favoured in things like the Hammer of the Emperor with all the stratagems that can support them, and Combined Regiment for those lethal hits, which the multi-melters really like against enemy tanks and monsters. Going through the variants, the battle tank seems to have gone up a bit to 180. That is a bit of a shame, as I think that was one of the better ones. Really quite nice general purpose damage, rerolling lots of hit rolls when it needs to, and it could take damage buffs quite well, such as extra AP from Fields of Fire, or the Lehman Russ Exterminator, or ignores cover from the Hellhound. The Demolisher's 190 and lost 2 shots on its main Demolisher battle cannon. To my mind, that's a bit weaker overall. I was hoping for a bit more of a points decrease compared with that. It's still fairly scary against tanks and vehicles though. The Executioner is 170 points, and that's the same pretty much. I feel like maybe people in Combined Regiment might be looking at that with a bit more interest. I personally really quite liked it before with the lethal hits rounding it out, so it's quite good against both infantry and vehicles, very general purpose. It just comes with a fairly weak special rule and hazardous rolls. The Vanquishers, nice, cheap and cheerful for 145 points, unchanged. They were pretty solid before and remain solid now. Definitely not going to be reliably popping enemy tanks and not very general purpose at all, but making up for it by being quite so cheap and still threatening every so often to do something fairly spectacular. I've also chosen to rank the Tank Commander here, which I would have ranked him a bit higher before. He's gone up to 235 points, so plus 10 there. He gained +1 order, which is a very nice boost, but also he tended to take the Demolisher cannon as well. And as mentioned, that got toned down with only D6 +1 shots rather than D6 +3. Given that the Rogel Dawn Tank Commander seems to only be a very small amount of points more than him, I just don't see why he wouldn't upgrade to that one. You just get way more stats. The shoot on death rule is pretty good admittedly. I still certainly wouldn't say that these are outright bad at all, just maybe a bit more overshadowed, and I'd expect to see more tank orders coming from Dawns. Finally, we've got the Lehman Russ Eradicator, which went up to 170 points, so a big +20 there. That one gained a surprisingly powerful durability rule, where if it's in cover it's also -1 damage. So now this one's by far the hardest Russ to shoot down at range. Ideally, if you can make this one the one that the opponent has to deal with first, then that would be a great idea, provided you can make sure that it still gets a cover save somehow. Its damage output really does lag behind the rest before. That was true at 150 points, and it's even more true at 170. I feel like often when people are taking big tanks and vehicles to skirmish with each other, generally more damage tends to be the winner over more durability. Though I think it definitely got a fair bit more interesting. I think I'd be a lot more positive about it though if it got the rule change and didn't go up a big 20 points. Finally, as if that weren't enough tanks, I've also rated the regular Rogel Dawn battle tank here. It's got the same big chunky stat line that it had before, with a big 18 wounds at a 2+ save, absolutely covered in guns between the Oppressor Cannon, Pulverizer, Stubbers and Melters, and has its once big aimed cancel damage thing. It can work really well with things that buff AP or strip cover. I think generally I probably would have rated it a bit higher than the Rosses, particularly after some of the changes that they got, but now there's a new boy in town with the Rogel Dawn Tank Commander. And given that that one's only a very small amount of cost upgrade compared with this one, again I feel like people are going to be fielding Rogel Dawns, but it's probably going to be via that datasheet as the first port of call, unless you feel like you're very adequately covered for tank orders already, and there's not really too much more value in going excessive on them. Next up, there's the trusty Hellhound, 125 points for the flame tank of the guard, and this one gets you a Chimera chassis tank with a fairly sturdy 2+ save, and then pretty good overwatch between an Inferno cannon and a heavy flamer, which can be quite nice to park in range of a mid-board objective and dare the enemy infantry to try and take it. As well as that, it can be pretty good just to have one in the army for the stripped cover special rule, so maybe use the secondary weapon to perhaps try and hit that into a unit that you're going to shoot with a bunch of other tanks, maybe things like Lehman Russ battle tanks, or maybe Rogel Dawns with their sort of middling AP profiles. I think they were really quite solid and kind of stand out at 115 points. At 125, I think they're a lot more borderline. I think including one in the list for that Overwatch threat and its special rule isn't the worst idea though, if you've got the right sort of tanks and big guns to be able to boost with it. Continuing onwards with Tier 2, I struggled to fit all the guard units on one page. Next up we have the Armoured Sentinels, which certainly took some hits in the latest update. Toughness 8 walkers with a 2+ save that are genuinely very tanky for their 65 point cost, usually walking around with a las cannon and hunter killer missile, able to reroll wound rolls against monsters and vehicles, so a little bit more punchy against them, even if their damage output realistically doesn't really compare that well to tanks. I think these guys felt the nerf of dropping down from a 3 model max unit to a 2-man a bit more than the Scout Sentinels, as it means they're not quite as efficient for things like stratagems or orders, and they can't even use the reinforcement stratagem at all now. And between all that, they feel like they're more niche than they were previously. They still are very standout for their durability though, one of the single toughest units for the guard. They seem usable enough supporting an armoured list, maybe being the units to stomp up and take a bunch of incoming fire, and hopefully making enough of a nuisance to themselves that they need to be dealt with if the opponent wants to stop them being on mid-board objectives and doing secondaries and things, while leaving the other tanks and armour not quite as damaged. Next up we've got the guard transports, which I'd rate as really quite well balanced right now. Previously it used to be Chimeras all the way, though in the December update they went up considerably to 85 points, which certainly wasn't good news for them, but I still feel like that probably more puts them as a solidly usable alternative to the Taurox as opposed to flat worse. The Taurox itself though does look like it could be one of the go-to options, 65 points and unchanged. This one's basically a cheap and effective metal box to transport you guys up the board in. Quite a good threat range for getting special weapons where they need to go, with a 12-inch move and the ability to advance and drop. It means that in the bridgehead strike or in the mechanized assault you could be slingshotting a unit of Scions or Kazakin really quite a long way and opening fire with all their special weapons at close range. It does have a little bit of firepower with the autocannons, though not really quite so much that you couldn't afford to advance and miss out on it. I feel like with those new detachments being a thing, it could be the time of the Taurox to be played a bit more. Having said that though, as I mentioned, I feel like the Chimera is still a very usable transport tank. It is 20 points more, and I certainly expect a bunch of people to go for the cheaper option, but you get really quite a lot of perks with this. Compared with the vast majority of transports in the game, you get quite a lot of guns all over it, potentially 2 heavy flamers if you want those, the las gun arrays, a heavy stubber on top and a hunter killer missile, that could add up and does kind of well in combined regiment as well, getting a lot of lethal hits against enemy light infantry. It's also tougher than the Taurox and more capable of soaking up enemy fire. Its firing deck allows a couple of people to fire out the top if it makes sense to, and it has the ability to issue orders from within it as well. If you happen to have an officer embarked and they don't need to get out, again it'll be good in all the transport detachments. Could be interesting enough to have it re-rolling all hit rolls with the enhanced engine sear in the mechanized detachment, and I feel like despite the points increase, these guys are still very usable indeed. Finally, and rounding out the guard transports is the Taurox Prime. Certainly paying a good chunk more than the regular Taurox for doing a similar job, though it does have nice perks for the Scions. This is the one that allows you to reroll all hit rolls when they target the same thing that the Taurox did, and that's pretty great in the mechanized detachment in particular. You can have Scions rerolling all hit and wound rerolls, plus whatever else they get from things like, say, orders, or sustained hits, or the +1 to wound from getting out of a transport. It maybe feels a little bit less key in the bridgehead strike, given that for that one you could say have an order to get you to hit on a 2+, and the Scions would reroll hit rolls of 1 just due to the detachment rule, so maybe better for Scions that aren't in that particular detachment. On top of that, it does get some nice firepower included for the extra 25 points. I feel like the Taurox Gatling cannon with its new profile could actually be one of the more interesting ones. 8 shots with strength 4 AP 0, but devastating wounds and twin linked, so that's fairly reliably putting out a mortal wound or 2 when it shoots. which feels like it contributes a fair bit to making up the difference between that and the Taurox points costs. I still say this prime's far more niche, maybe even more so now it doesn't have the wound rolls attached to it as opposed to the hit rolls, probably ranking towards the lower end of tier 2 or upper tier 3. Next up we've got the Cadian Castellan, 55 points for a Cadian character, up from 45. It seems for that he's gained an additional order, which I think does add to his value really quite a lot, and beyond that he has sustained hits 1 for his unit, so he helps people shoot straighter, and he gives you fall back and shoot for the unit as well. Between that for a unit of Cadian shock troops, it means that he's actually quite good if you want a damage dealer unit that's going to be able to keep on firing turn on turn. And maybe that could be more interesting for the more platoon-focused detachments, like the Siege Regiment or the Recon element, where ideally you're going to have some platoon units skirmishing in the midboard and dealing some actual damage with special weapons. I still say that maybe he's a bit of a tough sell versus the command squads, where you get a bunch more bodies and quite a few different advantages there. And it feels like he'd really quite like to roll with Kazakin, but it's just a shame that he doesn't have the scout keyword, so he'd stop the squad from scouting if he attached to it, and that is a bit of a shame for him leading the Cadian elites. Next up we have the one and only Sly Marbo himself, who seems to have dropped down from 65 points to 55. He's the guard lone operative who can infiltrate, and I feel like for the sort of role that you'd like to use him for, either screening in the midfield or doing lone operative things, lurking behind the lines and taking up ground and being ready to do secondaries or do a tiny bit of counter-attacking, losing 10 points is kind of massive for how good he is. I feel like the drop from 65 points down to 55 genuinely turns him around quite a lot, to the point where he feels like a genuinely quite competitive unit. For his actual damage, he gets a whole bunch of attacks with Strength 5, AP 1 and Damage 2, both at range and in melee, and they all have precision. He did take some small nerfs in the Codex, with his return fire becoming more limited and not being able to move after doing that, but overall at 55 points I feel like people will find places in an army list for him, particularly being the single cheapest infiltrating thing that Guard can take. I think is quite a nice selling point, and he does have some advantages for the Ratlings being on the front line, even if he also isn't tough at all. Next up we've got the other regiment command squads, with the Cadian command squad and the Krieg one, both of which are 65 points. These ones feel a bit more relevant versus the Kaschan one to me, given that the Cadian and the Death Corps actually have some special weapons that are worth buffing, and just feels like the unit overall is going to be a bit of a better big investment if you want something that can actually give and take blows in the midfield. The command squads give you more bodies in the unit, which is never a bad thing for some extra durability. They have one order which can be broadcast at long range with a master box, plus one OC from the banner which also wards off against battle shock for that role. And with spare models can contribute a special weapon or two, and maybe a power fist on the commander. For their buffs beyond that, the Cadians get cover on objective, so it makes the Cadian shock troops tougher if they take a point, which kind of works quite well with their sticky objectives too. And they also have a medic that can allow you to revive models. The Krieg one has a whole bunch of scattergun things, there's one more body in the squad, there's a once per game extra order with that servo scribe, a 6+ feel no pain against mortal wounds weirdly enough, leadership 6+ at base for the squad as it's a Lord Commissar leading them, and also allowing orders and stratagems to take effect when battle shocks, which is a little bit on the niche side but not really the most unhelpful for the guard. I'd say out of the two maybe the Krieg squad adds a little bit more to its unit compared with the Cadians, though they both seem reasonable enough to me, and are quite good for the platoon focused regiment detachments, and can also be used if you want to broadcast Lord Solar orders far and wide to everything within range of 24 inches of the master box. Finally for tier 2 we've got the Tech Priest Engineer of the Guard. This Adept of Mars still costs 45 points, and he grants a 4+ invulnerable save and healing to a nearby vehicle. The healing D3 wounds is pretty nice added value, the 4+ invulnerable maybe it is a bit more on the niche side just due to the big important guard tanks having a 2+ save, so if you're in cover you're unlikely to be reduced to worse than a 4+ anyway, though it could help out against things like railguns or great big melter weapons with AP4. As well as that, he's a pseudo-lone operative near vehicles, and it can be handy just to have him around as an extra unit to sit on objectives or do actions and things. And if the enemy does get close, he's actually slightly surprisingly fighty for a cheap support character. If a vehicle dies near him, then he gets boosted numbers of attacks with strength 6 and damage 2. Between all that, for 45 points, he's usable enough. He'd obviously need some big relevant tanks to improve. I feel like he's fairly tempting in the Hammer of the Emperor detachment, given that you're almost guaranteed to be going heavy on tanks in that one. And there's a fun enhancement in the mechanised one as well to allow a damage buff on a transport vehicle as well as its normal stuff. That does seem like worth it extra value to make a weirdly shooty Chimera. Moving onwards and upwards into tier 1 though. For this one I decided to break it into a tier 1 upper and a tier 1 lower. This one's the lower half of things, maybe just things that are a bit more standout to my mind versus the rest of tier 2. First up, we've got the Militarum Tempestus Scions, which look like they're an important unit to a bunch of different detachments. They've gone up slightly from their already slightly raised points cost, so they are getting a bit on the pricey side at 65 points per 5 of them or 130 per 10. We now know that despite being printed in the Codex without it, they will not lose Deep Strike. That's going to be coming in a day 1 FAQ for Games Workshop as yet unreleased. So that still means they can go dropping in for secondary objectives as a relatively cheap Deep Striker, though admittedly not quite as much as before, but certainly still seem to be strong enough for their damage dealer role. They changed to reroll wound rolls rather than hit rolls, so reroll wound rolls have borne against everything and all wound rerolls against things on objectives, and that feels like the bigger buff to have on the unit out of the two of them. They can put out a fairly fearsome amount of damage output, particularly in Bridgehead Strike and the Mechanized detachment, and in most of the rest they've got interesting things for them. They'll enjoy the lethal hits against non-vehicles, and can be unusually hard to take down in the Recon one. In Combined Regiment they could be a good option for using reinforcements on as well if you take a big 10-man squad. Overall, they still seem to be a solid damage dealer unit with a bunch of special weapons, working well in the command squad and the Taurox Prime, though I feel like they'll have some strong competition from Kadakin, which really seem to be one of the winners of this update. While we're talking about the Scions though, if you're taking them in a damage dealer role, then it usually makes sense to take either 5 or 10 Scions, and then the next one being a command squad, these guys being 75 points per 5 of them, up slightly from 70. They have the normal command squad upgrades, now healing D3 Scions rather than providing a feel no pain if you take the med pack, and they also bring an order and the sustained hits 1 buff to the unit, so it makes Scions hit spectacularly hard between all of those layered things. Between all that, they can have some pretty huge damage output when jumping out of reserves or Taurox Prime, again particularly in Bridgehead or Mechanized, and given how strong Bridgehead Strike seems to have been doing already, I feel like in the Codex they've still got plenty of things to make them really good, even if they have gone up a further 5 points. Next up, I've still chosen to rank the Leman Russ Exterminator a bit higher than the other Rosses, even in the context of it going up from 170 points up to 180, making it one of the very priciest Rosses now, along with the Battle Tank and just slightly under the Demolisher for the regular non-tank commander variants. And for that you get the twin autocannons with 8 shots to 24 inches and 4 shots further than that, or with twin links, and then handing out its AP debuff rule, so 1 unit shot by it gets extra AP from everything else shooting it. I think despite receiving a flat nerf here, it's still going to be a really interesting one. It's still got all the supporting things that a Russ has, and a fairly general purpose damage gun. I think that AP buffing rule though is just such a good one to have in the army somewhere. There's just loads of units that'll get a fair bit out of that, and can allow you to focus fire to take down one big threat with a high saving cover. Still seems like it'll be a good choice for the Combined Regiment as well, particularly with the context of the changes to Fields of Fire. This is the one to go for if you want to mark 1 unit for AP-1 better from all your guns. Next up we've got Ursula Creed, who went up 10 points, but also like the Cadian Castellan received an extra order as well, so she's got 3 up from 2, and 2 of which can affect her squad if desired, so you could layer a lot of buffs on a big platoon infantry unit. As well as that, she gets her discounted stratagems. 1 regiment unit within 12 inches can have a -1 command point stratagem each battle round, and a fair few of the detachments have stratagems that you might only really justify if you could reduce the points cost for them, maybe some of the whole army buffing ones, and it could be handy enough for some units as well, like say the Cadian heavy weapon teams overwatching, or helping out Combined Regiment with Fields of Fire, or a fair few others. I think she's fairly detachment dependent, given that her value does depend on the stratagems that she can get, and also you'd want the relevant regiment units that can actually take the orders and the stratagems, but does feel that as before she'll be interesting enough to have lurking in the backfield, maybe with some Cadian shock troops, perhaps putting sticky objectives on a home objective, and then buffing whatever things she needs to. Finally, for this section of the tier list, and for once I'm finally not putting Lord Solar Leontus at the absolute top of the top for the Imperial Guard, though I still think even while the focus is going to be on a bunch of other things after the Codex release, he really did lose a lot of relevancy. He's still really quite a strong unit between his rather nice orders and his command point generation. It still seems that he's staying at 150 points, and he can issue out 3 orders to things nearby, potentially over the Voxnet if he's in a command squad and a infantry squad block, and he can do so to both squadron and regiment units as per the balanced data slate. On top of that, the automatic 1 command point generated each turn is really quite nice. Any of the detachments that have high value stratagems will quite like that. And he also gets to redeploy things, and on top of that, his own personal stat line isn't awful either, alright damage and defense, kind of somewhat equivalent to a Space Marine captain. In general, the usual play with him has tended to be to attach him to an infantry squad and command squad, which admittedly does increase his cost by quite a bit. Have him camp the home field objective with a fair bit of objective control, fire out his orders to things and farm his command points most of the game, and then push for the midfield in the later game. and get his objective control lackeys to work and scoring some last victory points. I feel like things are a lot better though, where he's just an option that you can use as a big centerpiece model, as opposed to literally the first place that every guard list starts. I think it's still fairly nice, but won't be mandatory anymore, and that's definitely a good thing. Finally, and getting to the upper tier of Tier 1, I feel like these final 4 units will be pretty strong regardless of detachment. Gaunt's Ghosts are 110 points, and they have a 6-man unit of 2 wound lone operatives, meaning they can stay safe from enemy firepower, and even if they do take a little bit, it likely won't just kill them dead straight off the bat, and they get the Callous Assassin style rule of returning to reserves and then turning up the next turn essentially via deep strike, pretty much being the go-to unit to do secondary objectives, and they're still able to contribute a little bit even when they don't have one that they desperately need to do. Hopefully deploying somewhere that's far enough from the enemy that they're still safe, and chipping in a bunch of volume fire with their las carbines, plus an autocannon and sniper. I really like them just being quite so flexible as a unit. You can also throw them at an objective and have at least a reasonable chance to take down a squad of light infantry. If they're charged, they might get a few attacks in to start with as they have fights first, and they can also do a bit of synergy for the rest of their army, issuing 2 regiment orders when they arrive, and they can order themselves for a little bit more accuracy if needed. Potentially they could also think about staying on the board, issuing themselves extra objective control and pitching in to take a point in the latter turns of the game, if that does look like it's going to be the more reliable way to get victory points later on. They will be competing a bit against the Callous Assassin, which can do a similar job for 10 points less, though I feel like the extra utility that they bring is enough to justify them, and a few detachments can help them out at least a little bit. Some easy damage buffs from things like the Combined Regiment or the Bridgehead Strike, or a few of the other infantry focused ones. Even with all this going on, I'd still say for 110 points, probably lower end of this section, I could have put them in the lower half of Tier 1 as well. Next up though, and perhaps some of the biggest winners of the Codex, are the Katakin with a small but vital change. The Katakin are the Cadian Shock Elite, scouting infantry with a 4+ save and a whole bunch of special weapons. They are one of the infantry units that can threaten to take down tough stuff, and also pitch in with a hotshot sniper and a melter mine when the enemy gets too close. Their special rule is to get a bonus self-order, which means they can both be moving faster and shooting harder, or being harder to kill, and also +1 to hit if it makes sense. Lots of flexibility there. And the nice quality of life change that they got was that they can now use this after getting out of a transport at the exact same time as they got access to that mechanized assault detachment for +1 to wound when they get out of transports. It looks like they're going to be super nasty in that detachment, potentially a +1 to hit, +1 to wound, and whatever other buffs you can rustle up for them, potentially buffs from Sentinels or Lehman Russes and things. Beyond that though, they're just pretty good in the other detachments, and a good focal point for stratagems, and characters can potentially join them a bit better in the Recon detachment with a 5-point scout enhancement that could allow you to join them with Acadian Castellan there. These guys certainly seem interesting, jumping out of a Chimera or a Taurox hurtling towards the enemy and dealing loads of special weapon damage with their order in full effect now. Next up we have the big bad centerpiece that is the Rogaldorn Tank Commander. 265 points, so turning out a little bit cheaper than it was shown off in the book. And for that one you basically give up the ablative plating rule of the regular Dawn, but get some really nice buffs. I think for 25 points extra, getting not 1 tank order but 2 is really great value, particularly given that it can order itself, so rather than having to worry about keep within range of another tank commander or coordinate with Lord Solar and an expensive infantry block in the backfield, it can just order itself to go a bit faster or shoot a bit straighter. It's really nice that it doesn't have to worry too much about positioning other than anything else that it might want to give its secondary order to. On top of that though, it's got really quite a nice extra rule with inbuilt rerolls, rerolling 1 hit roll, wound roll and damage roll. So between the increased points cost and the losing ablative plating, it's not quite as ridiculously tough as the regular Dawn for the cost. It still really isn't all that far behind and does shoot far harder between its own inbuilt orders and these rerolls. Overall, I think it's really quite strong on a chassis that's really quite general purpose in the first place. Loads of guns to dish out some general purpose pain that pretty much nothing in the game is really going to want to get hit by too much. It'll still really enjoy the Combined Regiment with a fair few mid-strength profiles that'll enjoy the lethal hits against tanks and monsters, and seems like it's absolutely made for the Hammer of the Emperor detachment. I guess you'd probably be running multiple there, with a 6+ feel no pain on one and reroll hit rolls of 1 inbuilt into another. There's the option for a third one to get an extra tank order if you really want one to. Overall, between all that, at the moment, I feel like for 265 points, these are rarely if ever going to be a bad choice for the Guard if they stay that way. Finally, last but not least, are the ever-reliable Scout Sentinels. 55 points and unchanged in cost. They took a couple of small technical nerfs in the Codex, but nothing that really changes their role too much to my mind. You can only take them in units of 1 or 2 now, though usually 1 was optimal anyway for handing out multiple copies of their special rule. and now their special rule just marks one target for reroll ones to hit in the shooting phase and doesn't do anything with it in direct fire. That's still absolutely fine though. Getting a focal buff that could affect a whole load of other guard units is really nice just for 55 points, and particularly so on a unit that can scout into the mid-board, make it a nuisance of itself and do secondaries and things. It's pretty tough for the cost, and does still have at least a little bit of threat with a las cannon, a hunter killer missile, and a sentinel chainsword for some chip attacks if it gets in melee. Overall, between all that, I'd just basically say that Scout Sentinels are really never a unit that you're going to go too far wrong with. Taking, say, a couple of individual ones in pretty much any guard list seems absolutely fine. In any case though, with some of the gems of the Codex talked about, that's just about the end of this one. Let me know what you make of the new units and their points cost, which are the ones that you'd be rating as the strongest for the guard right now, and which would be the weakest for you. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below, and I'll certainly be interested to see what people are running with competitive army lists when people do start to take them to tournaments in earnest. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. I'll certainly have plenty more for the guard, and feel free to check out the other videos on the channel. I've already done a full Codex review and a couple of detachment ones as well. I'm sure there'll be a few more to come in the future. Finally, if you'd like to help support the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.